Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kelly Zaney, Vice President of Education and Exhibitions for Illinois Holocaust Museum. On behalf of Susan Abrams, our CEO, our board, our staff, our volunteers, I am so excited for today's program and to be with my colleague Rahim, who's going to facilitate what I know is going to be a remarkable discussion with Judy Batalion about her new book, The Light of Days, The Untold Story of Women Resistance Fighters in Hitler's Ghettos. When we were building the museum about 12 or so short years ago, we knew that the story of Jewish resistance was one that we had to tell through our core exhibition. And then in 2019, we had the opportunity, thanks to the generosity of Harvey L. and Jack Miller, to enhance and augment our core exhibition to tell the story of Jewish armed resistance through the ghettos, the camps, and through the partisan movements. And as a team, as we were talking about what are the stories we want to tell, we knew right away that we must tell the story of women. From the kasherut, the couriers of the ghettos, to the stories of Zivia Lebekin, who was part of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, to Lisa Derman, a local survivor who with her then soon-to-be husband, Aaron Derman, fought in the partisans, to individuals like Rosa Rabata and so many others who risked their lives during the revolts and uprisings in the killing centers and concentration camps throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. When I did a quick Google search, Judy, of your book this week, there's over 1,600 hits. So your book is blowing up like crazy, from the New York Times to the Jerusalem Post to the HuffPost. And it really is, when I read it almost a year and a half ago, you're my kind of writer. You're so descriptive and rich in your language, an incredible, incredible storyteller. So I'm so excited for you and Rahim to get into it and start talking about the incredible motivation and consequences and challenges and trauma that these young women faced. And I think in one of the recent interviews of you that I really love, that you talked about the book, and you talked about these remarkable young women being smart and cunning and brave and courageous, and really these kind of masterminds behind these uprisings and these movements. But the one thing that I really love that you talked about, because at the museum we talk about the power of being an upstander versus a bystander, and how you should take a stand, right? Use your voices and choices to speak out against the issues that matter to you. And one of the quotes that you talked about was how you really believe that these small acts of resistance matter, that rebellion matters, and that speaking out against injustice, even if we may lose, even if it's going to be hard, that it still matters. I absolutely love that. So before we begin, I want to thank our community partners for their continued support. Again, I want to thank the generosity of Harvey L. and Jack Miller, and I'm excited to learn about the conversation today and turn it over to my colleague, Rahim. Rahim.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you. And thank you all for attending today, this Sunday afternoon. Thank you for being here, Judy. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really excited to be here, and I thank you so much for having me and for hosting me.
Absolutely. This was a great book. When Kelly gave it to me, I read it. I started reading the first night, and I couldn't put it down, even though I had other assignments. And I started jotting down so many notes and so many things I wanted to ask you and talk about. And when I was preparing for this, I learned so much about you too and your journey. And one of the biggest themes in this book is identity. And I wanted to start it off talking about your journey, because you didn't always think you were going to become a writer. You actually dabbled in so many different other things I don't think people know about. You were in performing the arts. You were a stand-up comedian. You were a scholar. Can you talk about those formative years of when you were just figuring yourself out, and how did we get to this point, and now that you're a writer?
You guys have done your research over there. Well, let me begin by saying that I am 44 years old, and I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. So I think that kind of says it all. I've had many different careers and many different interests, and partially because I'm just interested in a lot of different things. And as you say, I was I was going to be a doctor, actually, and then I was going to be a lawyer. I was a scientist, and then an academic, and then I was going to be a stand-up comedian, and then I worked in museums. But the one thing that I always did in all these different realms was write. No matter what, I was writing, either for myself. I was just talking to a friend who was reminding me I used to send her 20-page birthday cards. This is when we were teenagers, with jokes and cutouts and letters. And I guess I've always just written. And it took until later in life for me, though, to really commit to being a writer as a career. And I think part of that was that I didn't have the confidence to make that commitment. And part of that was, I still am interested in so many different things and so many different realms that I find it hard to make that commitment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really interesting how your curiosity actually led you to this book. It wasn't something that you had planned or thought you were going to do. You actually found it when you were looking for someone else. And one story about women's resistance led to 20, then a couple of hundred. Could you talk about that feeling when you were discovering these stories? Because there's always this notion that women in war and Holocaust were submissive or just had given up. And these stories were out there, but they were kind of hidden. And what was your reaction when you discovered this? And how did you develop that sense of responsibility to pitch it to your literary agent or your publishers?
Okay, Regina, that's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Let me start at the beginning. So let me
Yeah.
tell the story of how I came across this in the first place. So this whole book happened completely by accident. I absolutely never set out to write this book. It started 14 years ago. Someone recently told me they called it an odyssey. I was like, yeah, this was an odyssey. I was living in London at the time, and I was exploring my own Jewish identity. I am the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and I'm very interested in the emotional legacy of the Holocaust, in the way trauma transmits over generations. In my own case, I'm a very anxious person, and I was thinking a lot about, how much of that comes from my Holocaust heritage. And I was thinking about danger and how I reacted to danger, how I perceived danger, and again, how much of that was impacted by my family's history. And so I decided to write a performance piece. It was even going to be partially funny. I hoped it was, about strong Jewish women who had confronted danger. That was kind of my initial idea, out of my own personal question about how I could handle danger. And I decided to write about the one woman who came to mind. She was someone I studied in 5th grade, was Hannah Senesh. And Hannah Senesh was, for those who don't know, she was a young Jew, about 20 years old, who before the war moved to what was then Palestine. But during World War II, decided she wanted to fight back. She joined the Allied forces. She became a paratrooper. And she volunteered to go back to Nazi-occupied Europe. And all those years later, I thought of her. I wanted to understand who this hero figure was, but I didn't want to understand her as a hero. I wanted to understand her as a person. I mean, who goes back to Nazi occupied Europe? Who chooses to do that? Seriously, like, what is the psychology? What is the personality that does that? Because it felt so far from my own. So I became interested in her, and I decided to go to the British Library and research her, and there were not very many books about her in the British Library. So I just ordered whatever they had, and I noticed one of the books was a bit unusual. It was an older book. It was covered in fabric. It was dusty with old lettering, and it was also in Yiddish. It was called Frauen in die Ghetto, Women in the Ghetto. And as I always say, even more unusual is that I speak Yiddish. So I started flipping through this book, looking for Hannah Senesh, but she was only in the last few pages. In front of her were dozens and dozens stories about young Jewish women who defied the Nazis, with pictures and names and snippets and chapter titles like weapons and ammunition, and there was an ode to guns. And this was just so different from any Holocaust narrative that I'd ever come across, ever. Both different in content, different in tone. It was passionate and furious and alive. And and that's what drew me to this in the first place. I had no idea it was going to become this book, but that's how it all began.
Yeah, absolutely. And could you talk about, because I know you started the book off with like a respect to your grandparents. Could you tell our audience the story that your grandmother used to tell you every day?
My mother was a survivor who talked a lot about her experience in the Holocaust. And, every day she would tell me, I mean, literally, it was very important for her. I didn't write about this in the book, but I'll tell you. She watched sitcoms. Every day she watched soap operas and sitcoms, and she believed in laughter. And she told me this every day. We would sit down to watch Three's Company. We would watch TV together, and she would say this: it's so important to feel laughter. But Judith, let me tell you why. And she would every day tell me the story about how her sisters had, four of her sisters had been killed, and one of them was as young as 9 years old, and how much she missed them. And she would also tell me the stories of her escape from Poland, though it was always in little bits here and there. It never formed a really coherent narrative. But there was times where she was in a convent. She was hidden in a fruit truck. There was a Nazi who turned a blind eye and let her pass a checkpoint. And she was with my grandfather, and they crossed the Russian border, and they were put in camps, work camps in Siberia. That is how they survived the war. They never talked about those camps though.
Yeah, and when you were writing this book, I know you said it took you a while to buy into doing it, and you talked about in previous interviews how your publisher convinced you to do it. Like, when did you buy in? When did you know like this is what I'm going to do, and what was that process like?
So when I finished this book in um, 2007, I was 30 years old. I was single. I was living in London. I was working as a comedian. I was working in the art world. Honestly, the last place I wanted to spend my days was Warsaw in 1943. So even though I knew I had found a treasure, at the same time, I wasn't really ready to delve into it. Um, and so, I immediately applied for a translation grant that I was received from the Hadassah Brandeis Institute in Boston. And then, I thought it would take like 6 months to do it. I spent 5 years doing this translation. I think they'd given up on me. And usually I'm very fast with things. But in this case, I wasn't, I really could only work on it in drips and drabs because it was just too hard. It was too hard emotionally to read these stories. Yeah, so then when I handed that translation, I kind of was like, oh, maybe it's over. Almost a relief at that. But then they were like, wait, we should publish this as a resource for academics. And then of course I was like, of course I have to take this out to more people. And we talked about ways of doing that. Then we talked about doing it as an annotated publication. Then I decided I was going to write this as a novel. And I began to put it together and is fiction. And I actually took my grandmother as a character and combined her with the central character in this book. And I started writing it as a novel. And then it was in 2017, the history of the history, that that the women's marches started. And suddenly it dawned on me, like, wow, I think maybe there is a bigger audience for these stories, for stories of women who resist, of organized female fighting back. And I happened to be having breakfast with my literary agent who, it was about something else. And I like mentioned it in passing. I told her I might do this as an academic version and then as a novel, and then maybe we could do both. And she was like, wait a minute, Judy, did this actually happen? And I said, yeah. She said, no. Jewish women were taping guns to their torsos, arming underground units, shooting Gestapo men. And I was like, yeah, this really happened. It was in the, and she was like, she was the one who really was like, you have to tell this as a true story. And you have to write it as nonfiction, as narrative nonfiction. She was like this, you owe it to the story to tell it as the truth. So then I spent 6 months doing something else, writing a comic novel about something totally different that I then put in a drawer. And then after that, I don't know, I like sat down in like a week and wrote a book proposal, and then we sold that, and then here I am. So very long answer. I think it took me a long time to feel that the zeitgeist was ready and that I was really ready to dig into this as a full-time project.
Yeah, and that brings me to my next question. Speaking of being ready, do you feel like the world is ready for this now, especially with the rise of many women empowerment movements going around, especially on social media and everything? Do you feel like the world is ready for these kind of stories? Because they are incredible. It's like some of the stories, women as like young as 15 and up, just doing these incredible things. Like I thought I was like reading like an action movie sometimes. It was just like, wow, they did this. And like, do you think the world is ready to receive this, especially because it was so hidden for so long? Like these are not new stories. It's just it hasn't reached the mainstream as much as it should.
I mean, I hope the world is ready. I think they are. The response I've received so far has been so exciting and overwhelming. You know, after 14 years of having these people living in my head, they're my friends. I like smile when you talk about them because I feel proud of these 15-year-old girls. And now to know that there has been so much interest is very, very moving for me. I think, I'm going to answer that by telling you that I've spoken to, obviously the book just came out, but in the past few weeks, I have spoken to a number of high school students. There's a children's version of the book too. It's the blue one here with my matching coordinated outfit. And I speak to middle school and high school students, and to them, they're interested in the history, but really the questions they ask me are about resistance. They're about what strategy should they be taking away for their activist work and for their social activist work. And I had a long discussion with the other day, and they're, I'm not a violent person. I don't feel I can do that kind of work. Are there other types of activist work I can do? And so for young people, I hope, and it's very moving to me if this is the case, when they take this as they're looking to these women's roles in the underground as for examples and for inspiration for how they can fight for justice and liberty too.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I think we're in sync because I was going to ask you, what is the difference between this book right here and the young readers edition? Could you explain that?
Of course, the young edition, let me pull it out. It's the blue one, it's a much shorter version of the book. It has less historical background, and it also has fewer characters. It's even more narrative. And there's a little bit more explanation of just terms around the Holocaust. And there's a glossary at the end. But at the end of the day, it really has the same kishkes. It like has the same guts. It's the same story, focusing on these women in the underground and telling their really dramatic, incredible tales.
Yeah, and what was the one story when you were writing this? What is the one story that stuck with you, and like why? Like what was it? If there's one, because there's so many.
So many.
Yeah, there's so many.
I can't have a favorite child,
Okay, let's not play favorites.
but I can tell you one of my favorites.
All right.
But which one to share now? I mean, there's one story about this woman, Bella Hazan, and she immediately joins the underground as soon as the war. There's without a question. She's tall and blonde, and she can easily pass for being a Catholic Pole rather than for being Jewish, which is what many of these operatives, they had to be able to do that because they were leaving the ghettos. So Bella was able to pass, and the underground posted her into the town of Grodno. And she was posing as a Polish girl living in Grodno. So to do that, she had to have a day job. Otherwise, she needed a cover. She needed you couldn't be suspect about anything. So she went to the employment agency and applied for a job. And, she was giving her credentials, and the person says, "Oh, we have the perfect job for you." What's that? I said, "Oh, we'll give you a job. You're going to work as a secretary at the Gestapo." So she became, and in fact, she spoke Hebrew. She didn't even speak Yiddish that well. And her bad Yiddish is what had come off as good German to this Polish employment agent. So that's why I was like, "Oh, great, you speak German. That's a great position for you." So she became like a receptionist and an interpreter in the Gestapo office, serving them tea and working on language translation. And so she really had this incredible double life. And she would steal documents from the Gestapo and bring them to the Jewish underground, who had quite elaborate forgery. I mean, they were makeshift, but they had forgery units to make fake Aryan passes and IDs and travel documents. So one of her roles is she ended up stealing all these documents and bringing them back to the Jewish underground. But my favorite part of the story is that one of the men in the office developed a romantic crush on her and invited her to the Gestapo Christmas party. And of course, she couldn't say no. But that night, she happened to have two other couriers who were both smuggling weapons for the underground, staying in her room as part of their cover on their way. So they all dressed up and went to this Gestapo Christmas party together. And there's a photo of them in my book of the three of them posed as young Catholic girls at a Gestapo Christmas party in 1941. I just think it's such a great story, and I hope you can enjoy the photo.
Yeah, there's plenty of great stories in here, and I know that's probably what's hard to pick one, but I would like to circle back to the young readers edition. What age range do you recommend for them?
The young readers edition is intended for ages 10 to 14.
10 to 14. Okay.
My daughter just read it, and she's 9, and we had a meaningful conversation about it. So I think it depends, of course, on the child. It does require some pre-existing knowledge of the Holocaust.
Okay. And I know this book is totally different from your original book. Your first book was a memoir. And how did you have to adjust stylistically and personally to writing this book from a memoir?
That's a good question. I was actually very happy to do that. I was really sick of myself as the subject of my writing. I think, there's kind of this cliche that everyone's first book is about themselves. And that really happened for me. And a lot of my earlier kind of career writing was personal essay and then a memoir that came out of I wrote a lot of personal essays and kind of put them together in a memoir. And after years of touring with that, I really was sick of talking about myself. And I think that's also part of when my agent suggested this, even though it took me some time emotionally to commit. I was ready for a project that felt very far away from myself. So I think that all kind of came together at the right time. I mean, stylistically, I do have the beginning and end of this book are written in the first person. Sort of, it bookends it with my journey of writing this book. This book required a lot of description to really set the scene. And obviously, this book has 65 pages of footnotes, which you don't need to read. Don't worry, but they're there if you need them. So it's a very different kind of project.
Yeah, and one of the things that with the theme of resistance in the book, there's many ways you can resist and fight and be brave. How did your definition of bravery and resistance change from the start of the book to the finish, or did it change at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's a lot of discussion about what counts as resistance. Some people say that if a Jew just stayed alive, that was resistance because the Nazis wanted all the Jews dead. So staying alive is resistance. And there are other people that say, well, you can't say that, there's a difference between hiding and staying alive and between being part of an organized underground movement to try to go out and fight Nazis. I don't value one over another. What I try to do in my book is really show a range from women who resisted by, setting up soup kitchens or helping orphans or hugging a barrack mate to keep her warm or telling jokes to alleviate fear. And others who I talk about blew up Nazi trains and were assassins who snuck their way into offices and shot Gestapo men in the head. And then there were many of my characters are these courier girls or cacheriot, the connectors, who, pretended to be Christian girls and slipped in and out of ghettos, bringing information, false documents, cash, weapons, ammunition, dynamite, smuggling people, working for rescue networks, helping Jews find hiding spots, paying off the people hiding them, dealing with problems with that. I think what changed for me is that I think I began the project with, and not consciously, but I think I too had a subconscious idea of Jewish passivity. And that's why when I first found that Yiddish book, as I say, I was shocked by the content, but also the tone. It was so full of life. It was action. It was women jumping off trains and dyeing their hair and running out into fields and it just, for me, the whole story of the Holocaust shifted in tone. And now I see it as a story of constant action, of constant resilience and defiance, of constant struggle. I mean, most people were still killed because they were battling. I mean, they were up against a massive military force, but this story brought so much life to a narrative that had felt somewhat staged for me before.
Yeah, and not everyone in the book died. Could you talk about some of the women that survived, and for people who had not read the book yet, could you share a few stories of survival as well?
So many of these women died, of course, but some did survive. And the last section of the book takes place after the war. And this is because I personally am fascinated by the question of how these women coped, how they continued surviving, even for those who survived, or how did they go on? These women that I write about, they were in their teens doing this underground work. When the war was over, they were in their early mid-20s. They had the rest of their lives ahead of them. They had no family, no home, no country, no nationality. They were often in a new place, and they had to recreate their whole worlds. So for some of them, like my central character, Renya, she actually wrote about her experiences in 44, 45, and there was knowledge of her story around that time. It just dissipated. But Renia, after writing her story, that her writing in her case was really part of her therapy. It was part of her coping. And the feeling was she wrote it and kind of put it away. And this enabled her to start fresh. It helped her start fresh. It helped her move on. And so she sort of started a life she moved to what was then Palestine or Israel, and she settled in Israel, in Haifa, and had a life where she was known as a fashionista, a humorist. She did a lot of work with refugees. She did work with children. She worked in healthcare, many helping professions. And she almost never talked about her story with her family, with her children. And I send them information about her. It was part of her moving on to put the war past her.
Yeah, and did you find that there were particular characteristic or personality traits that were common in all of the women that compelled them to take action? And if so, what were they?
Yeah, so I've like thought, obviously this whole project started with my like psychological question about like who goes back to fight Nazis? What's going on? What personality does that? So I thought a lot about why these women fought in the ways that they did. And I have two answers. And the first answer, I think, is that many of these women before the war, they were part of youth movements. And these youth movements were, this was very common for Polish Jewish youth. And these youth movements were intellectual and spiritual, emotional and social training grounds. And the women that I write about were generally part of these socialist youth movements that valued equality and collective living. And they like literally, and they were very psychoanalytic, self-awareness, pride in your past and in your heritage. These were the values that they promoted. And I think in these groups, these women really learned both to know themselves and to have a strong sense of strength and weakness. They learned confidence, they learned pride, and they learned how to work together. They often lived together before the war. And so during the war, when these units became militias, they knew how to work collaboratively. This is something that they'd worked out before. And generally these groups promoted female courage and strength. Like that was part of their education. So I think some of this comes out of their training and their education. But then also a lot of these women who survived, to me, it was very interesting. Many of them lived well into their 90s. They really lived long lives. And I thought a lot about that. Like, why would that be? And I think for many of them, they were women who had a very strong sense of instinct. They were actors. They were doers. I'm not. I'm a self-doubter. I'm like that. You know. I'm worried. But I feel like many of these women were. You know, one of the Renia's sons said to me in passing as I was like leaving their apartment, it was like, you know, when she crossed the street, she wasn't someone who looked left and right and left and right. She crossed the street, and that I've talked about this before. It really stood with me, and I feel like they were like that. They were women that they had a good sense of intuition, so it made them good undercover operatives too. And they acted on gut, and they were very self-directed like that.
When you were sourcing for this book and learning about everything, were you able to connect with relatives or descendants connected to the people in the story? If so, like what were their responses, and what are some of the responses you got from the book so far?
Yes, I spoke to about 20 different families. So you can imagine there's a lot of families also involved in my head. And in general, most people were really, really very happy that I was telling this story. Most of them, they're not professional writers. They're not, they're not people who are in a position to publicly share these stories. So I found in general, there was a lot, they were very grateful that I was doing this work, and they were very open with me because of that, and shared a lot, which I was very grateful for. But since, sorry, this is what I was going to say. I've already lost my mind a bit. But since the book came out, there's also been another layer of outpouring of people who are emailing me who I'd never even connected with. And they're like, oh, was that Tosha Altman on the cover? That was my great aunt. And, I didn't know. And, oh, my great grandmother, I know she worked in a hospital in the Warsaw Ghetto. She helped people escape. She never talked about it. Did you ever come across this name? Someone tweeted me a picture of his grandmother and her sister in a forest with guns. And, saying, I know that this is in our heritage. I don't know anything more. So it turns out my main character now I got an email from a whole strand of family in the US who had no idea about her. And we've been emailing, and I'm like, we were trying to figure out if they were related because everyone changed their names. And then I mentioned she had a brother, Aaron, and they're like, oh, Aaron, we met him 5 years ago in Israel. And then it turned, so they had no idea. They had no idea about Renya, that they were even related, certainly had no idea about her amazing work in the underground. So now I'm like making shidduchs, I'm making matches between families who are related to these women and sharing that. So in general, the response has been positive and encouraging and feels fruitful from families.
Yeah, I can imagine how rewarding that must feel just to discover all this. And with all of that happening, what do you plan to do next? What is next for the book then? Where you have all these people and you're rediscovering so much new stuff. What do you do next with it? Because you have to do something, right?
I know. You think something's finished, and then this book goes on and on. I don't know. That is the honest answer. I had a brief meeting with my editor last week. I was just telling her about some of these emails coming in, and we were talking about, like, I could write another bit for another edition, but I don't even, like, people are sending me family documents and photographs, and I don't know. I've been thinking about doing something on my website, having a kind of archive for these stories. But then do I start my own archive? I let me know if you have any advice. I'm genuinely not sure yet. This is all really new. So I'm trying to figure out, obviously I want to collect these stories and save as many as possible. So we'll see.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the people that will read your book or have read your book and would like to know more about this, are there any source material that you can share that can be checked out at a library that others can look into? Maybe people who have survived that have memoirs or something. Could you share some of the material?
My book has a full bibliography at the end. So every archive I worked in is listed there. Every memoir that I used as source material is listed there. And so I people keep asking this, and I'm like, it's all in that bibliography. So it depends what you specifically are looking for, but it's in the book. And you can always email me if you have questions. I might not be that quick to respond these days. Give me a few weeks, but I'm very happy to help direct you if you need that.
Of course, thank you. And what countries or some of the other women from, like, other than just Poland, or like what other areas were they from?
So I really had to just focus on Poland because it was too much. When I started this project, I found these women listed in this Yiddish book. There were a few dozen, which I kind of assumed was the whole thing. But the minute I started reading I tracked down their memoirs, their testimonies, each woman mentioned 10 other women in her story. And then I would research her, and then she would mention 10 other women. So the project really mushroomed and grew. Now I forgot what your question was.
Oh, No worries.
My own brain is mushrooming. So direct me, Raheem.
Yeah, I know this is like your last run for the day, and I know, but we appreciate your time, and it's still so much. Like this is something that just it seems like it's never ending because you continue to discover new things. And for me personally, it was incredible just learning about these stories and wow. So like, what do you see big picture wise for this? And for your career, like what do you hope, like when you finish this, when it was done and you had this in your hands, what did you hope for next?
I mean, that's a good question. So, well, I mean, I'm working on the screenplay right now. I'm co-writing it. So that would be, I mean, it would be amazing to see these stories on screen if that ever materializes, which I hope it does. I think there's such cinematic and dramatic stories that they would be very compelling. I mean, what is my hope? I don't know. I'm a writer. I'm in the page. I want to make the story as good as I can. I don't know that I even think about a hope for for anything. I just wanted to tell the story. I want people to know the story. I want these women's their courage to inspire other people.
Here's another question. Here's something. who who surprised you by their response from the book, like someone maybe in your realm, another writer or a public figure, like what was the reception of the book so far for you?
You know, that's a good question too. And I'm going to answer it in a kind of soft way that I feel, you know, something that really surprised me was I'm always like, I've lived with these characters in my head for 14 years. So anytime someone else is interested in them, it's like shocking to me because they're so personal to me. It's amazing. But I think one thing that was really very encouraging to me was the really positive response in Poland that I received doing research there, working there. I hired a number of Polish translators and assistants who I needed, drivers, fixers. I needed a lot of help. I don't speak Polish. And they were mainly young people in their 20s and 30s. And they were as passionate about the story as I was. I met someone, she was going to be my translator for a day to Beijing. She showed up at the car. She had done research for me. She had documents, she had maps, she was so excited about this story. And that was very moving to me that young Polish women now felt very strongly that this is part of their story too, and part of a story of resistance. Right now, there's a very strong feminist movement in Poland, and they really felt that this was an important story for them to know from their heritage and to sort of bring forward in their political work right now. So that was definitely a surprising response.
Yeah, I can only imagine just how rewarding that must be, and I'm sure in the coming weeks you're going to get much more. Could you talk whatever happened to Raina's sister, Sarah, in the book?
I can't give it. I have to leave something so that people
I agree. I
can
agree.
go by the book. I can't tell you. We know Rennie lived. I told you that. But you know, you have to read it.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to transition. We got about a little bit more than 15 minutes left. We're going to transition to the audience Q&A. I'm going to run down as many questions as I can. For those who are listening, please, this is the time to submit your questions. Judy and I are going to get to as many as we can. All right, let's go. How many women in the book knew each other?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I wrote about resistance groups that I said they were already part of youth movements before the war. So many of the cases that I write about, the women did know each other, and the movement had turned into a militia. So these women had worked together already in a very different capacity, as you know, to doing farm work and Jewish education and psychology readings, to now trying to blow up Nazis. It was obviously different work, but many of them did know each other before. And some of them joined the folds during the war. But even that was hard. It wasn't easy to join the undergrounds. People were interviewed. You had to show that you were dedicated to the movement, that you weren't just gonna, you had to show that you were able to keep secrets. They needed to trust you. Not everyone got in.
Yeah. And I recall you when you were learning about this, you talked about when you were studying different women in the book, you was connecting the dots in a way as well. Some of the stories were associated with each other. So that must have been really cool. And have you written your grandmother's story? If not, your grandparents' story. If not, will you?
I've written little bits of their story. I don't know a lot of their story. But that is a great idea for a novel, perhaps, because that's something that I can fill in. Thank you.
Yeah, and how did writing the book impact the feelings of post-Holocaust and Holocaust generational anxiety? Like, how did the writing the book impact that, or your life in general?
Yeah, I mean, I can't answer that it took away my
Yeah.
anxiety. I now have no anxiety, and I don't know. No, that's not true. But I think that it just gave me a sense that there, you know, it gave me a sense that there are different ways. I started this whole thing about looking for how I perceived and reacted to danger. And I think that working on this project just helped me understand that there are many ways one can react and to danger. And sometimes you flee, sometimes you hide, and sometimes you stay and you fight, or you pause and you chat, or there are different options. And I don't know, on a personal level, maybe that opened me up. I can definitely say during the pandemic, I live in New York, and when it began, everyone we knew left the city, and my husband, he's British, and I always say he's all blitz to my blintz, and he really said, no, we're going to hunker down here, and we're gonna pass it through here. And I don't know, and we stayed, and I don't know if it was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, but in a way, I'm happy in this case we did, because I hope it taught my children that sometimes you can stay. I'm not saying always, but sometimes you can stay and work through it that way. And I think a little bit of my own decision to stay had to do with these women too, and just how they gave me a different understanding of how you can react to dangerous situations.
Absolutely. And who compiled and wrote the Yiddish book that you found in the British Library?
Okay, so that Yiddish book was it was compiled and edited and translated by someone named Leib Schizman. It was published in 1946 by the Pioneer Women's Organization. And it was actually translated, I only found this out much later. It was actually a collection of mostly Hebrew articles and memoirs and snippets from newspapers and obituary books that he translated into Yiddish in order to tell American Jews of the amazing exploits of young Jewish women during the war. And I write more about that in the book as well.
And how did these women in the book freely go in and out of the ghettos? If it's written in the book, you don't have to go too deeply, but you know, it's an audience Q&A.
So I spent a lot of time trying to understand all these details of how underground work worked. So there's a lot about this in the book. They did not freely come. I mean, it was hidden and covert. But I can tell you some techniques. Some women literally, they would cut areas of a gate or find a loose area of the gate and slip through. Many of them were really tiny. And so they literally slipped through gates. Some of them climbed over walls. Some of them went through basements. There were kind of connections through a cellar or basement to the outside. It depends very much on the ghetto. There were over 400 ghettos in Poland alone, and each one had a very different landscape, both in terms of its how, like politically, the leadership, how it was structured, but also physically, it had a different landscape. So some ghettos were part bordered by water, so someone could swim across that border. Obviously, at night, you know, when no one was looking and at risk to their lives. In Warsaw, the courthouse was on one of the borders of the ghetto, so you could actually leave the ghetto, go through the courthouse, and just, you know, leave into Aryan Warsaw. There was also in some area of Warsaw, there was a marketplace that bordered the ghetto and in and out. So there were certain places where it was easier to disguise yourself, or was more commotion, or was kind of easier to pass in and out. Some people came in and out through, this was a very common way, was Jews were sent out for forced labor in work groups. And so they would either bribe their way into a work group or just blend in with a work group and exit and enter the ghetto with that work group. So there were different techniques depending on the ghetto.
All right. And do you hope this book will find a way into other translations such as Polish, or will it be translated and sold in other countries as well?
Yes, it's going to be translated into, right now, I think 20 countries or languages. And it will be coming out in Polish next year.
Also, what about audio books and things of that as well?
There is an audio. You can already, it's available right now for purchase.
All right. And another question is, did any of the women fall in love with the Nazi?
That's a good question. They used their feminine wiles to trick Nazis all the time. But I did not read any cases of them falling in love with a Nazi. That didn't come up. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it didn't come up in any of the testimonies or memoirs that I read.
Yeah, and being that you have an age appropriate version of the book, do you hope to get it into classrooms, or how do you pitch it to districts to get it aware of, to put it into classrooms?
I certainly hope to get it into classrooms. I mean, the children's publisher sort of works on that end of the pitching it to schools, but I myself am speaking to many schools. So if you want me to come speak to your school, get in touch. You can find me on my website. And I'm hoping through that as well, it'll start to mushroom like everything else, and more schools and more students will read it.
Yeah, and what do you hope for young children who are reading this book? Like, what is the message you want to send to them?
I think it's the same message that we started this whole program with. And it's the message that I've said that before, that, you know, that these women went out against every single odds. They were starving, they had nothing, and they were going to fight the German army. The biggest armies in the world couldn't defy Hitler, but that didn't matter. What mattered was they still went out to fight for freedom and to fight for what was fair. And they risked their lives doing that constantly. And I think that's the message, that when something is right, when something is just, when you need something to be corrected, to be made just, then you have to go out and fight for it. And even these small acts, they didn't topple the Nazis. That doesn't matter. Each of these acts meant something to them, meant something to the people around them, and means something to me and to us, I hope, generations after. So these, as we started with, these small acts are meaningful.
Absolutely. And you read hundreds of stories of women resistance. How were you able to vet them and to decide which ones you were going to use? Were there anything that was like inconsistent, or anything like how did you decide it to which ones to use?
That's a really good question. And there are a few different factors. Some of them just have to do with a more writerly factor, like people who had survived, who had left more material, who had left more robust narratives for me to work with, could become bigger characters in the story because I literally had more information and more material about them that I could write with. I knew their narratives. The more detail I knew of their lives, as a historian, the easier it was for me to then translate them to the story. But it was also important for me to show women who did different types of resistance work, and a little bit to show women from slightly different backgrounds. Most of the women are from a similar background who I do talk about, but I wanted to share some people who are sort of Yiddishists or Bundists or from other backgrounds that, I have a little bit on partisans in the forest. It was different in the east of the country. There was even an amazing resistance effort of 30 women at Auschwitz. And I kind of taken aside and share that story because how could I not? So I tried to show some variety as well.
And last question as far as the Q&A. Were the underground resistors religious or more political in their outlook and motivation?
So that's a really good question. And I should say that I was writing specifically about people who are part of a more secular socialist Jewish movement. That's the original book I found was really about socialist Zionists. And then I added a few socialist Bundists too. But that sort of stayed the main locus of my story. So there were a few women who had grown up in religious homes, but they themselves became more secular. So that's the story that I'm telling. There might be other stories of more religious women involved in this, but I didn't tap into that, or I didn't come across that.
Yeah, and thank you so much for your time today. I want to say again, this was just a great book. I truly enjoyed reading it. And for those who have read the book or who are watching, how can they follow you, whether it's social media or like, how can they stay in contact with you, and especially your works going forward?
You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Judy Batalion. On Facebook, it's at Judy Batalion Author. And I have a website. It's just www.judybatalion.com, and that has a contact page too. And I get those messages. I do. So if there is something you want to share, or question you have, do feel free to get in touch.
All right. And thank you all who are watching and who spent the Sunday afternoon with us. Before you go, could you please take a moment to fill out the survey in the Q&A? I'm about 6 weeks into this, so any feedback and anything is greatly appreciated. Also, all of our upcoming programs are listed in the link is listed in the chat as well. Thank you all for attending, and thank you again, Judy. This was great.
Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. Have a great day, and everyone else have a great day as well.